Good afternoon and happy Monday. Want to go ahead and get us started. We are recording the lecture, so thank you, Jim, for your expertise. Just want to welcome our distinguished guests, our faculty, staff, and students of the college, but also friends and colleagues from the campus as well, and friends. I'd like to welcome you to the 2023 George Jones Jr. and Velma Rife Jones Lecture. I'm Frankie Santos Wa'anen, and I have the honor and privilege of serving as the Interim Dean of the College of Education. I am thrilled to host this event today because it was 4 years ago, in 2019, when the college held its last Jones Lecture. COVID touched every facet of our personal and professional lives, including the lecture series. Before I begin, I would like to make some acknowledgments to a few individuals who helped make this event possible. I'd like to acknowledge the Dean's Office staff and the team, my team, who assisted with the logistics, the planning, supporting our Dr. Burt, and just making this event happen. So thank you to my staff. I also want to recognize and thank the faculty committee with the graduate student representation who selected the visiting lecturer. Thank you for your hard work on this. I also want to recognize Dr. Lawrence Parker. I did see you, where are you? Right. Dr. Parker's department chair, and also the faculty in the Higher Education Administration program for nominating our distinguished visiting lecturer. So thank you for your work there. I also want to recognize our partners and colleagues at the graduate school, Dr. Darrell who is the incoming dean. Congratulations on your appointment. And I also want to recognize Dr. Tiffany Balfour, who is the Associate Dean for Graduate Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the graduate school. There is another event that's happening tomorrow that's co-hosted with the graduate school. So thank you for your partnership, and we're just excited to continue our work together. So please join me in recognizing these individuals for their support. The Jones Lecture Series was established in 1996 by the late Velma Jones. Velma was a University of Utah alumna, and she also taught at the University of California, Berkeley. She met her husband George there in the mid-1920s. He enjoyed a highly successful career in banking, ranching, and mining in California before the couple returned to Utah. It was Velma's most heartfelt wish to, quote, do something good for the kids, and indeed she did. The Jones Endowment contributes to education through full ride scholarships, faculty awards for research, and the biannual lecture. Over the years, the Jones Lecture has hosted such notable speakers, including attorney Benjamin Crump, famous for representing George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's families, Dr. Michelle Jacob, an educational leader in Indigenous Studies, Barbara Ainsworth, the Distinguished Sustainability Fellow and Regents Professor Emerita at Arizona State University, and Joan Mulholland, a civil rights activist. Today we have the opportunity to hear and learn from a notable scholar, lecturer, Dr. Brian Burt. And now I'd like to invite Dr. Jerrell Johnson, who will have the opportunity and the honor of introducing our visiting lecturer. Dr. Johnson is an assistant professor of higher education in educational leadership and policy. Started his career here at the U last fall of 2022. Dr. Johnson investigates issues of college student identities and higher education leadership and change across various institutional contexts. Dr. Johnson.
All right. Greetings, esteemed colleagues and friends. I'm Dr. Darrell T Johnson, Assistant Professor in the Educational Leadership and Policy Department. And now it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce to you our 2023 George Jones Jr. and Velma Rife Jones Lecturer, Dr. Brian A. Burt. Dr. Brian A. Burt is an Associate Professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis and Director and Chief Researcher of the Wisconsin Equity and Inclusion Laboratory at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, UW-Madison. Dr. Burt employs qualitative methodologies to 1, advance understandings of team-based science, 2, investigate experience of racially minoritized graduate students in engineering. Consequently, Dr. Burt aims to provide innovative comprehensions of the complexity of science participation. Further, through his research, Dr. Burt aspires to uncover the experiences that endorse or deter students from their science trajectories. Dr. Burt's scholarship has been published in highly regarded journals such as the Teachers College Record, the Journal of Engineering Education, and American Educational Research Journal. An accomplished and highly decorated scholar, Dr. Burt is a 2016-2017 postdoctoral fellow for the Spencer Foundation, a 2017-2022 National Science Foundation Early Career Awardee, and 2019 Diverse Issues in Higher Education Emerging Scholar. In 2021, Dr. Burt was inducted into Morehouse College's Martin Luther King Jr. Collegium of Scholars, and also received the William Elgin Wickerton Award from the American Society of Engineering Education. Prior to Dr. Burt's faculty appointment at UW-Madison, he was an assistant professor in the School of Education at Iowa State University. Dr. Burt holds a Bachelor of Science in Secondary English Education from Indiana University, Bloomington, a Master of Arts in Higher Education Administration from the University of Maryland, College Park, and the Doctor of Philosophy in Academic Affairs and Student Development from the University of Michigan. Dr. Burt is an exemplar for many emerging scholars traversing the landscape of higher education. I met Dr. Burt in 2016 when I journeyed to Iowa to accept a position in student affairs at Iowa State University. Since connecting with Dr. Brian Burt, I have been fortunate to witness his tenacity, hard work, and most of all, the care that he displays in ensuring that the field of education continues to thrive. Specifically, Dr. Burt's dedication to seeing graduate students to and through the field of higher education and graduate studies is a process that I aspire to emulate one day. The seeds that Dr. Brian Burt has planted in my academic pursuits continues to flourish even in my early career as a faculty member today. I can remember a time when I spoke with Dr. Burt in 2017 upon the early heels of my graduate studies. And in that graduate studies talk, Dr. Burt set an aspiration for me that I had no clue that I could achieve. He encouraged me to apply for the Spencer Dissertation Fellowship. And as a first-generation PhD, I had no clue what that was or even if my scholarship would be valued by such an esteemed academy. However, I applied 3 years later and received notification that I did receive that dissertation fellowship. Dr. Burt, I must pause and extend my deepest gratitude to you and to for your leadership, your mentorship, and your support throughout the years. Thank you. I end my gratitude note stating that you, now the audience, can see why it is no surprise that we are here today to learn from Dr. Burt about how to re-engineer graduate advising through a perspective of care. And so without further ado, because you didn't come here to hear me, I will say to you, I welcome, if we can all rise, and welcome our 2023 George Jones Jr. and Velma Rife Jones Lecturer, Dr. Brian A. Burt.
I am very rarely embarrassed, so thank you for that introduction. I am honored and extremely excited to be here delivering the J. George Jones Jr. and Velma Rife Jones Distinguished Lecture. I thank Dean La'anen, Dr. Parker, Dr. Johnson, the selection committee, Rose, Tracy, and the Dean's Office for your assistance with logistics. And finally, I thank you all for your presence, which to me signals a commitment toward care and graduate education, which we'll be discussing today. So I don't want to make any assumptions that everyone here knows each other. So before I formally begin, I'd like to spend just a little bit of time getting to know each other. So if you can turn to your neighbor, just the one to your left and your right, and introduce yourself. Perhaps just offer your name, year, department or program, and briefly, what are you hoping to hear or learn today? Very briefly. Let's come back together. Trust me, there will be more opportunities to chat with each other. This was the icebreaker. So you all had a chance to get to know each other. I need to get a sense for who all is here today. Do I have any undergraduate students here? Yes, excellent. Yes, excellent. Thank you. Oh, no, not undergrad? Oh, okay. Any graduate students? Graduate students, okay. Excellent. Postdoctoral researchers? Okay. Faculty? Thank you. Excellent. Staff? Wonderful. Thank you. Administrators? Okay. Any community members? Okay. Well, thank you all for being here. And you all shared a bit about who you are, so I'll follow your lead. You heard some of this from Dr. Johnson already. But I'm currently an associate professor of higher education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I'm also the director and chief scientist at the Wisconsin Equity and Inclusion Laboratory, affectionately known as the WE Lab. In my role, I have the privilege to work with amazing emerging scholars, most of whom are graduate students and most of whom are graduate students of color, all committed to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in higher education. The lab's work focuses on improving the educational experiences, outcomes, and workforce pathways for historically underrepresented individuals. So today's talk regarding improving the practices necessary for students' progress in graduate school aligns with my work and the work that we do in the lab. Now, as a professor in the field of higher education, I think a lot about graduate students, what they learn, how they learn, where they learn, who they learn with, and the conditions that enhance both their learning and achievement. And to be clear, when I say achievement, I don't think of, I don't overlay on students my definition of achievement. I generally inquire for students, what do you define as achievement, and how do institutions create the conditions to support your definition of achievement, because everyone's definitions of achievement are different. In doing so, under that big umbrella of graduate education, as Dr. Johnson mentioned, much of my work focuses on two strands. One, to better understand the experiences of Black men in engineering graduate programs, and two, to explore research teams as sites for teaching and learning. So as we begin this presentation will include a bit of interaction, so there's no hiding. I saw some people take a deep breath when I asked you to introduce yourself. So there's going to be a little bit of interaction, but I think that it's necessary for this kind of a conversation. And again, I'm using conversation intentionally. Simultaneously, I recognize that it can be challenging to sit during a talk. So for those of you who use social media, please feel free to use the hashtag JonesLecture and my handle, I guess it's called, Brian_A_Burt. In part, the strategy is to keep you actively engaged, but also as someone intentional about expanding access to information in college, tweeting can help extend our conversation to those who are unable to physically be here or those who don't have the same privileges as we do to be here. So please feel free to tweet or post as you wish. Today's talk draws from an article published in the Teachers College Record in 2021 titled, "Moving Towards Stronger Advising Practices, How Black Males' Experiences at Historically and Predominantly White Institutions Advance a More Caring and Wholeness-Promoting Framework for Graduate Advising." It was a wonderful product resulting from some intense thought work, brainstorming, and troubleshooting with students from my previous institution, my various research groups over time, and other collaborators, including your very own superstar assistant professor, Dr. Jerrell Johnson. So to begin, how many of you all received an A+ in your How to Advise Graduate Students course? Okay, no hands. Let me just scan, okay? Well, how many of you all received at least a B+ in your How to Supervise or Mentor Graduate Students Through Research course? All right, so that was my fault. You know, I generally use qualitative techniques, so what happened just now was I didn't ask the right questions. It wasn't you, it was me. Let me ask a better question. Who has ever taken a course on being an advisor or leading and mentoring graduate students through research? Look around. No one. So I started those prompts to acknowledge that many people occupying faculty roles do so without any formal training in teaching, no training in advising, and maybe some experiential knowledge from being in a research team. Maybe. So without formal training, how do faculty learn to engage advising and supervisory practices?
What your advisor did.
What your advisor did. Trial and error.
What your advisor didn't do.
What your advisor did not do.
Seminars.
Yes, some seminars. Although, yes, and notice, even with seminars and workshops, no one raised their hand. So even if you have taken a seminar or workshop, no one really felt confident enough to raise their hand. So it might have been a one-time thing, but yes. And certainly, you know, now you can get my articles and you can read them, but are they really being shared widely across faculties? But honestly, I do believe what we heard is accurate, right? Trial and error. And based on the experiences that they had as graduate students, both positive and negative, both humane and hostile. So while I put that reality out there, I'm not giving a pass to faculty for being jerks, or even worse, physically, emotionally, or psychologically harmful. Through this study, and through our conversation today, I call on professors, and those of you considering faculty roles in the future, to be better advisors by incorporating caring practices from a wholeness perspective. So let me offer some background. I often get a question about how did I arrive to this study? And for those of you who are graduate students or even early career faculty, notice that I'm referring to this as a study. This is one study within a larger program of research. And so if you have questions at the end or later on about how do you craft a larger research agenda and carve out smaller articles or studies, I'm welcome to answer that question at some point later on. But as a doctoral student, I often hung out with black and brown peers, most of whom were in the STEM fields. And I used to wonder, why are they always hanging out? Especially relative to education. They were hanging out much, much more than we ever did. So again, I wondered, why are they hanging out so much? So then, I'm still hanging out with them, of course. Then I start wondering, well, if they're hanging out so much, I wonder if they know that they're retaining each other by hanging out. And then I start thinking, well, if they're retaining each other, what are they retaining each other from? And that became the central question for the larger study about black men in engineering education. And I'll walk through it a little bit more, but it really started out of intellectual curiosity, something that I was observing, some phenomenon that I was seeing that I didn't understand. So in part, the genesis of the project, as I mentioned, was intellectual curiosity. I had burning questions and burning ideas, the title of tomorrow's presentation in the graduate college. But empirical research was needed to explore the phenomenon I was seeing. So from there, the plan was to start small. I didn't want to make the assumption that all black and brown students shared the same experiences across all STEM programs. So I decided to start small. I wanted to start with black men in engineering, with the intentions of then adding black women in engineering, and then Latinx students and other racial and ethnic groups, and then expand beyond engineering. The expansion or the extension has not yet happened because what I've learned is that there's so much information that still has yet to be uncovered. But now, hopefully on this side, on the other side of tenure, those newer projects will start coming. So I want to transition to just give a little bit of context about methods. At the end, again, if you have more questions about the how, why, when, where of the study, please feel free to ask those at the end. But the sample for the study included 42 black men in engineering graduate programs, both master's and doctoral. And this was one of the largest, if not the largest, aggregated samples exclusively focused on black men in engineering graduate programs. The study was framed based on a social constructivist perspective that, at least in part, assumes that individuals can hold, or that we can have multiple truths. They're not one truth, right? So multiple individuals can have experiences and they still be true because they're based on their experiences. There's not one monolithic experience. The other aspect about this social constructivist perspective is that, yes, individuals can learn, or people can learn individually, but I also believe that people learn even more through interaction with or observation of each other. This is important, at least for this context, because when investigating or exploring students' advising experiences, some of what we're going to talk about is based on some students' experiences, and some are based on what students observed other people having better or worse experiences with advising. So again, I believe how we make sense of the world is in part related to our interactions and observations of other people. Data collection included at least one-on-one interview. At some point I did switch to a two-time interview, and again, that's another really, really great research design conversation that I'm willing to have for those of you who are deep into research design of your dissertations or other studies. A team of 3 graduate students and myself analyzed the data, and I want to share a little bit about analysis before we get into the fun stuff. A theoretical framework was not consulted at the onset of the study. That is, I did not want to be bounded by what existing scholarship said advising should look like and what care might look like. This was particularly important because I didn't want to assume that care for black men in engineering looked like or looked the same as care for other students in K-12 education, which is where the majority of care literature originates. So I didn't want to make assumptions that care was the same. The other place where some people do talk about care a little bit is in undergraduate education. So again, I didn't want to make assumptions that care at the undergraduate level is the exact same as care at the graduate level. And finally, to be honest, I didn't want to overlay existing literature, usually focused on the experiences of white students, onto black men, for whom your own research from scholars here have shown that research and society show us that black men experience the world differently. So we initially analyzed the data from an inductive approach. But what we did find is that students were talking about this thing, this phenomenon, although not that many people actually named or used the word care or cared for or some other derivative of that word, we determined that they were talking about wanting to have these engagements, these experiences, these relationships with advisors. We deemed that as a form of care. So we then decided, after we had done the analysis, to consult Nodding's Ethics of Care work. Again, we aimed to create a practical advising model specific to graduate education based on the experiences of Black men, but likely applicable to those holding other roles. So let's start getting to the fun part. What we found in the study is that there were both levels of advising experiences and relationships, and interrelatedly, degrees of care. So we thought of this as strong and whole, basic and partial, weak and empty. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start with some definitions and some examples from participants from the study. And where is the microphone? Thank you. All right, so let's start with strong whole care advising.
Strong whole care advising. Advising facilitates positive experiences, uplifting practices, and a caring advising relationship. Advisor demonstrates an equal interest in a student's academic, social, career, and personal life.
Okay, so we have our first example from Quentin.
I can talk to him. We have lunch, and during lunch, we're not talking about work. We're talking about life, we're talking about family, we're talking about culture. And outside, or during the group meetings, they can sit there and drill you, but then, it's not something personal, and that they're doing this for your benefit as well, as they want your work to be the best work ever. Quentin, 5th year electrical engineering PhD student.
Thank you, Quentin. So notice from this example from Quentin, he very explicitly says that with their advisor, it's not just about the work. I want to start there. It's not just about the work. They're describing their advisor as somebody who they can talk to about almost anything. And because their advisor sees them as not just this product factory or workhorse, terminology that we use, right? Then it also offers, or it lends itself to this relationship of trust, where then they are okay with their advisor being more constructively critical of them because they know it's not personal. They know it's not a microaggression. They trust their advisor because of the relationship that they've built with their advisor. We determined that to be strong and whole care. So we move then to basic partial care advising.
Yes, so basic partial care advising. Advisor aids in a student's academic progress. Advisor assists student in meeting compliance requirements needed to advance to graduation.
And we will now hear from Jacob.
I guess they do everything they're supposed to do as an advisor in terms of getting us the technical stuff that we need for the most part. They sign our paperwork to get certain materials when they find the time.
Thank you, Jacob. So notice some of the highlights. I guess they do what they're supposed to do for the most part, right? So it almost sounds like a question. When they find time. So how do we make sense of that? How do we make sense of that, right? So this student, Jacob, is saying, my advisor does what they're supposed to do. They're doing the paperwork. They're walking me through the academic requirements. They're doing what they're supposed to do when they find time. Right? So again, this is basic because all the basic needs are met. But it wasn't as elevated as the advisor with strong or whole care. That was probably a little bit more present that was more present, that engaged with the student on a level outside of just the technical aspects. That's basic advising, basic or partial care advising. So then we have weak advising, weak and empty care advising.
Weak or empty care advising. Advisors' behaviors, actions, and/or comments are harmful to a student's sense of self, sense of belonging, and persistence toward degree completion.
And we have one final example from Thomas.
When I tried getting help to finish my degree, the advisor that I had, they didn't really pay me any attention. Thomas, third-year medical engineering PhD student.
So there were several examples of those like Thomas, but I think what I want to point out that might actually be very apropos, especially here at Utah, is this aspect about they didn't pay me any attention. And think about that as a third year, where you're likely in a important transitional point. After coursework, probably after qualifying exams, you're ready to move on dissertation, and you're also eyeing the time to degree. And time to degree completion is related to the financial implications of an extended program. And if I haven't heard anything else more than my time here so far, is how expensive it is. So having an advisor that you believe doesn't pay you any attention at a pivotal point has only the negative implications of dragging your program on, which is financially not the best for our students. So what I'd like to do now, you understand stronghold, basic, partial, weak, and empty. I'd now like to show you the models that we created, and we're going to walk through the model and have some time together to discuss it. So as you look at the model, I'm just going to briefly talk, and then I want you all to look at it. You can see on the left side the degrees of care. On the right side, the levels of advising experiences and relationships. Undergirding the whole thing are expectations of advising. So students were asked, what are your expectations of advising? And then later on, they told us what their actual lived realities were. And that's what you find in the middle. Students' lived realities and/or expectations of advising. So I'll give you a moment to look at the model, and then we'll come back together. You all can see your own faces. So just some examples I want to point out. At the very top, you can see advise a student from wholeness-based perspective. Under that, you see cares about student outside of classroom. Within the partial or basic range, and notice there that these are all intentionally ordered, and they're kind of within ranges. You can see in the partial basic range, creates a healthy environment. Notice that's in basic, right? That's an expectation. Advisors should be creating a healthy environment. That's not strong or special. Like, that's basic to create a healthy environment. And then towards the bottom, you can see creates barriers, maintains hostile work environment, and prioritizes student production over student wholeness. In the article, we thoroughly described how students were classified by their degrees of care and levels of advising experiences and relationships. their experiences and or thoughts about what more caring, advising experiences and relationships informed the practices you see in the center. And also in the full paper, we acknowledge that the majority of students indicated that they had basic advising, and I'm going to talk more about that at the very end. So this is another chance for interaction. With a neighbor, are there components of the model that you expected? Are there components of the model that surprised you? And how does the model and its practices inform your own advising experiences, practices, and or expectations for advising? Let's spend just a few minutes on that and then we'll come back together. I'll also cautiously call on some people from the audience if you would like to share. In a few minutes. Back together. If nothing else, this suggests that this could be an entire workshop, right? I think this is on.
That's a good point.
Is this on?
Yeah, it is. Okay, so I want to open up a little bit of space for a few people who might want to share. I want to acknowledge, though, what we have in the room. We have power dynamics in this room. And so if you are a student, I would understand if you wanted to talk abstractly and not about your own experiences because of potential power dynamics and concern of retribution. Let's be very honest, okay? So I do open the space for anyone who would like to react to these prompts because we'll have time for question and answer at the end. And if you can share your name.
Mine kind of
Is it a clarification of the model or something? Or?
Yeah, it's a clarification of the model. So I guess we were talking and we were wondering if there's not, well, it's kind of a multiple factor thing, but how does the student's positionality and experience impact this model? Because we can have different ideas of how an advisor advises, and if there's no consistency with the person, which is fair because we're not always consistent with what we do, then how does the student's perspective play out? Because it can definitely be influenced, or it can definitely influence this model, right? And I guess the other component too is, can advisors force whole care onto a student who might not be truly trusting of that care or truly wanting that care, because there's different expectations and traumas that the student can face or has in their past that make it so that care doesn't feel authentic. And so even if whole care does exist, if the student's experience is resistant, how does that impact this model?
Thank you for that question. Let me do an instant reaction to the second part of the question. I think one, and I appreciate you saying that, one aspect that I recall as we analyzed is students who were designated in the strong whole talked about the authenticity and how they felt it was authentic and also non-threatening, right? So I think that there is some aspect of the students, how they describe their experiences with advising, that's how we were able to categorize that group, right? There were some other people who there weren't this many, who might have had some indications of strong and whole, but they also said they weren't sure. There was some ambiguity in how they were discussing their advising experiences. So we didn't feel like that could be classified as strong and whole if they were questioning the authenticity. Again, these are based in part on students' perspectives and their feelings or their interpretations, right? So, and those also vary, but we tried to normalize students across. So what you're also seeing are students across first year through 7th-ish year. You also are seeing students the majority of students had one advisor, but in cases where students had multiple advisors, we had to code those separately. Another question in the back that I heard is, in engineering, in this context, students sometimes compound or conflate what is advising. So some of them are talking about advising in like how we might think in education as academic or paperwork or guidance. But for engineering or other STEM fields, that person also simultaneously often runs their research lab. So they are compounding advisor as this person who wears multiple hats. So there is some conflation that is also context specific that we have to take into consideration, and we do describe in more detail in the full paper. Thank you about that question about positionalities. Any reactions to the questions or to your own experiences?
As a pair, we had many questions, so we're gonna tag team this. Maybe. Okay, so my first question was, with this matrix, I guess, can you be empty and strong, or do they go together? And then my other question was, part of what I spend a lot of time telling faculty is that they need a network of mentors, that no one person will be able to do all of these things that they need, so wouldn't that be the same for graduate advising? And then we have one.
And a complimentary question was, could some of these behaviors, in a sense, be on a continuum as well? And how would that play into the matrix? And then what are the perhaps surrounding sort of nesting of relationships, similar to what Myron was saying?
Very good questions. In earlier versions of the model, there were demarcations between lines of where the different categories separated. We got rid of those because we realized they're probably fluid, right? And for the most part, some people were only asked a one-time or two-time about their advising experiences. It's possible that a first-year student could be asked about their advising. You could ask them again third year when they're in a different phase and or at the dissertation phase, and they could go up, they could go down, they could probably move back and forth. So there's a lot of fluidity in that model. There was another question that I really wanted to react to. Oh, the question about shouldn't graduate students have this network of mentoring? Yes, but that's different than advising. Students can't have a network of advisors, not formally, right? Faculty don't get, there's no incentive for faculty to informally advise someone who's not on their roster, right? So this is specifically students talking about who is your formal advisor, right? Not who is your network of care or your network of mentors. Students definitely do need that, especially if they feel like they have empty care or not the best advising. But also I would argue if students are having empty or weak advising experiences, they don't need to be with that person. That would be my argument. You mentioned multiple things, and I want to acknowledge those are all great questions, and what I'm most happy about are the conversations and the questions that this model is providing. Not necessarily that I have all the answers, because the data set necessarily didn't lend itself to all the answers that you all have. One more question, and then I'm going to wind this down.
So based on the matrix, and one thing that we kind of chatted about briefly. And I wonder if this came up in your study, specifically about vicarious trauma and racism that advisors may pass on to students. But mostly too, in thinking about this, there's days when I'm whole and strong, and there's some days I'm like empty and weak. And so I wonder if this came up for students who's speaking about, maybe I just woke up on the wrong side of the bed, or I just left a meeting where somebody treated me very horribly, and then I did not show up authentically in the space with that student.
Thank you. So that it gets to the question, is faculty advising static? Right? Is this model static? I think it goes to the previous question. No, I think there's the ability to fluctuate. And I think it takes a reflective and a reflexive advisor to understand when you aren't providing your best, right? I think one thing that we did talk about in the full paper, or we thought about as it relates to that question, is that also faculty are real people as well and go through life things, and there might be times where I'm just not good right now. I can also be a strong, whole advisor to one person and not the best advisor to another one. So we acknowledge that in the full paper. It isn't necessarily captured in the model to account for all the possible variability that you all are addressing. We do acknowledge those possibilities, and the point or the the expectation that faculty are assessing themselves in advising, and not necessarily just calling on students to tell them what kind of advisor they are, although it can be a two-way process. Does that address? Okay. I'm gonna put this here. I don't know. Okay. So I'm looking at the time. I want to make sure that we thank you all for engaging, at least in the thought process and wrestling with some of the messiness of graduate education. So as I wind down, I want to share some, you all already identified some of the feedback related to the model in the study. I want to share at least some other takeaways and reactions and pushback. So first, the majority of the students in the study were classified as having basic advising with partial care. In fact, the original title of the manuscript was slated to be Beyond Basic Advising. In other words, we call on faculty and future faculty to do better than being basic advisors and to use the strategies in this article and strategies that you all have had conversations about to work towards stronger, healthier, more caring and humanizing advising practices. Second, I received some questions, not identical to the ones that we just heard, but I received some questions related to who should be responsible for caring. As if to care in the way offered by the model apparently takes too long. Am I supposed to care for students individually? Or the one that really struck me was, well, when I was a student, no one cared for me. So these responses, from my perspective, are rooted in historical assumptions that women are only able to offer care, and that women students are the only recipients worthy of receiving care. As if men can't receive care and don't want to be cared for. And as if male advisors shouldn't be doing the work of being more caring with their students, which leaves women faculty to carry a heavier emotional load to advising and mentoring students. So a final insight, we didn't frame the model to be specifically for Black men in engineering, and we made it clear that the model was informed by the experiences of Black men in engineering, but not exclusively for Black men in engineering. By taking this approach, we aimed to make the model open for future testing and extensions to see if and in what ways it was applicable to other populations. I've received some minor pushback on this choice, but I argue that needed was a model for us to think broadly about the issues of graduate advising, and just like previous research, some of which the field, our field, believes is foundational, they too had single-race, single-gendered samples. Both those samples were usually white males. So I argue that Black men's experiences are equally as important to study and use as a foundational framework for theory and practice. So I conclude this talk with some thoughts directly from the article, and I'm just going to read directly from the article. For those who advise graduate students, what does it mean to know what students need and not provide it? I'm not suggesting that those who do not provide strong levels of care and advising do not care about their students. However, this may be the perception students hold. Creating more caring and whole advising experiences might be challenging for faculty members with long-standing modes of advising. However, moving toward a more caring and whole framework is necessary for future generations, especially those who will become future faculty members themselves. Moving toward a more caring framework might start with recognizing students' wholeness. This may include, but is not limited to, recognizing students' social identities, for example, being Black or male, as well as conflicts and barriers students may encounter in graduate school due to stereotypes associated with their identities. Understanding students' lived experiences will assist with creating more caring advising experiences, and developing more caring relationships may better assist students in progressing through degree completion and doing so more fully whole. Thank you for your attention and engagement. And with the remaining time, I welcome any reactions, questions, and comments. Yes.
Thanks, Brian. You know I'm a big fan of this work. I really appreciate how you acknowledge the gender component, and especially how you named that historically men haven't been allowed to give or receive care, and so I really appreciate that. One of the things that strikes me every time I engage with this model is the institutional level of it. Like, I think about, there are lots of institutional reasons why I might suck as an advisor. You know, if I have 25 PhD advisees, I can't take them to lunch even once a month, right? So have you spent time thinking through that, like recommendations at the institutional level to support faculty in being better advisors? Do you have thoughts about that?
Thank you for that question. I think to answer that question, I mean, there's lots of different variables. The institutional context, I mean, one thing that we talked about even earlier this morning are how is advising incentivized or rewarded? At my current institution, as I mentioned earlier, at my current institution, you know, for promotion tenure, there's research, teaching, and service at many institutions. For us, under the teaching banner, is advising and mentoring. But I know that that's not the case at all institutions. And furthermore, how departments or colleges interpret that is likely to be different. So I think one way is to think about what is the incentive structure for different institutions. The other thing is, I think that, and I don't have a full answer because I've seen this happen, and it generally is gender. That many times women and or faculty of color end up not always, many times I've seen, have the majority of advisees, right? So it's not just that they have 25 advisees, it's that there's a disproportionality going on. It's not like everybody has 25 advisees. Some people have more advisees and some people have less. So I think that we have to first name that and acknowledge it. And then, I mean, I said this in the article to the At the U article. Identify it first and then think, how can we dismantle and redistribute that, right? And in doing so, in the redistribution, we also need to reward and affirm those who have already been going above and beyond historically. That is if we really care about our faculty and the work that they're doing, and if we want to retain them. That was kind of my instant reaction. Okay. Yes. You get the last question. It's gonna be great.
So I'm kind of curious on how advising sort of passes down narratives. So like survival strategies I think are really important for like, how do we go through graduate school? But I'm also curious to see how this can also be harmful in ways of maybe passing down assimilatory practices or our expectations of what a graduate student is. And is that authentic care if they're really looking out for them, or is it not wholeness because it's assimilation rather than exploration of the student's individuality?
Okay, let me see if I can, I'm not going to be able to restate verbatim what you said. Perhaps let me restate as much as I can remember how I heard your questions. The first one, I think I heard you say, how do advising practices, how do they go through generations, both good and bad, right? Two-way, or both, yeah. And the second one was, advising practices, like if somebody has a particular advising practice, but that doesn't necessarily meet a particular student's individual needs. That's how I interpret it. Is that a way to think about it? What we talk about in the article is that to have strong whole advising is to not think of students as a monolithic, right? and to get away of this one-size-fits-all model. So for example, I don't have 25 advisees. I'm using myself just to be vulnerable as you all have been. I don't have 25 advisees, but even in the number of advisees that I do have, I understand that they come from different backgrounds. They have different experiences. They have different desires professionally, post-graduation. I can't treat them the same because they're different people. And that takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work. And it takes me being reflective. It takes me being reflexive and being able to pivot and change. Now, there are some things that, as a faculty member, I can foresee some barriers that may be coming up for them. For some students, they respond well by hearing my suggestions. And some students, I have realized, have to learn by doing. And I have to be there equally for both sets of students. I also have some students, they evolve students evolve over time. Identity development, maturation. I also have to understand that my students aren't fixed. So my advising practices also have to evolve over time as my students change. That's how I think about it. I can't say everybody should be exactly like me, because there are also other advising practices, but that's at least what we talk about in the article and we give some thought to. Now, in terms of your question about how do advising practices just get passed down, I think it goes back to the exact question that I started with at the beginning of how do faculty learn how to advise? Trial and error, some workshops maybe, talking with colleagues. What Dr. Phil Bowman will say at Michigan is when people go through trauma, they tend to revert back to their trauma. I think going unchecked, some people, especially those who went through trauma during graduate school, without going unchecked, may revert to advising the way that they experienced it, right? It doesn't have to be that way. Is this gonna be, okay, this is gonna be posted, and that's fine. I have tenure now. I didn't experience this firsthand. I had a different experience, but there was someone who was known to throw staplers at students. I didn't get the staplers, I had the stack of papers, right? But I made a choice. When I become a faculty member, I will never do that. But I had to be very conscious and present then. I had to be conscious and present when I started my faculty career, and I've been conscious and present all along the way, even when my experiences with students are challenging. And when I want them to do well, and I want to tell them how to do well from my perspective, I'm not going to throw staplers and papers at them, right? But it takes me being conscious of it. So anyway, I'll stop. I don't want to ramble. But yes, I think that it does take a lot of mental work to decide to be better and not to be basic. Yeah. Thank you.
First, I want to acknowledge those of you who are here and just thank you, Dr. Burt. You know, this is, in my humble opinion, they're here because they wanted to learn from you, also take away the research, the empirical work, but also translate this in ways that actually will affect change, but also change people's lives. Because it is about we embrace the caring concern of others, right? And so thank you for that. And I also want to, on behalf of the College of Education, faculty, staff, and students, so let's give Dr. Burt another round of applause. Read the inscription. So it is the J. George Jones Jr. and Velma Rife Jones Lecture Series presented to Dr. Brian A. Burt, Distinguished Guest Lecturer, University of Utah College of Education, 2023. We have a reception that follows this session, so please join us outside for some snacks and some beverages. So thank you once again, and please stick around. And thank you all very much.